The wind howled across the desolate landscape, whipping rust-colored sand against the tarnished metal of starport Y-87. Gabe Rusty Anderson squinted against the grit as he dragged his meager belongings across the landing pad. His boots echoed hollowly through the abandoned complex, exactly as advertised in the listing, completely, utterly deserted. Perfect for what he had planned. Home sweet home, he muttered to no one, his voice immediately swallowed by the vastness of the abandoned starport. The sales listing hadn't exaggerated about the isolation. 3 massive, corroded gate rings dominated the horizon, their once gleaming surfaces now dulled by decades of neglect. Beyond them stretched nothing but barren desert in all directions. Gabe dropped his duffel bag and pulled out a batter flask. He took a long swig, grimacing at the burn of cheap synthetic whiskey. How had it come to this? 5 years ago, he'd been full of optimism, ready to revolutionize interstellar agriculture with his organic space farming concept. Natural growth beyond gravity had been his slogan, catchy, meaningless, and ultimately worthless. He'd mortgaged everything for that dream, taking loans from the Galactic Agricultural Bank with their predatory, pioneer incentive interest rates. His farm on Proxima B had been state-of-the-art. Hydroponics that responded to musical frequencies, soil enriched with asteroid minerals, and drone pollinators programmed with ancient Earth pollination patterns. And yet, harvest after harvest failed. First, it was the solar flares that disrupted his calibrations. Then, market fluctuations made his specialty crops worthless overnight. The final blow came when the Interstellar Trade Commission reclassified space-grown produce, subjecting it to tariffs that made his business model impossible. The bank had been unsympathetic. "Your signature is right here, Mr. Anderson," the loan officer had said, her tentacles pointing to 17 different places on the contract. Section 143 B clearly states that acts of God include solar radiation, market volatility, and regulatory changes within 3 parsecs of contested territory. 3 weeks ago, they'd seized his farm, equipment, and even his grandmother's recipe database. The last item particularly painful since the recipes were worthless to anyone but him. Left with nothing but debt and despair, Gabe had made his decision. He'd use what little credits remained to buy a one-way ticket to somewhere isolated and end it all, quietly, without bothering anyone. That's when he'd seen the listing, abandoned starport, ideal for final stands or scenic suicides. Absolute privacy guaranteed. No neighbors within 500 kilometers. Price to sell. The cost had been suspiciously low, exactly what he had left after buying a few supplies. It seemed like fate. The real estate AI had processed his purchase in minutes, transferring ownership with remarkable efficiency. Unusual in a galaxy where bureaucracy typically moved at sublight speeds. He hadn't questioned his good fortune. Now, standing in the control tower of starport Y-87, Gabe looked out over his purchase. Through dust-streaked windows, he surveyed the 3 enormous gate rings. They were unlike any starport design he'd seen before. More ornate, with strange symbols etched along their edges. But that hardly mattered now. What mattered was that he was alone, truly alone, with no one to witness his final moments. To cosmic irrelevance, he toasted the empty room, raising his flask. He'd give himself a day or 2 to work up the courage, then it would all be over. The automated sales bot had included a crude map of the facility in the purchase documents. According to the schematic, the starport included a control tower, where he now stood, maintenance bays, storage facilities, and something labeled primary calibration chamber in the center of the complex. Gabe decided to explore. No rush, after all. His appointment with Oblivion could wait a few hours. The maintenance bays were filled with equipment too sophisticated for Gabe to identify. Strange tools hung on walls, their functions mysterious. In one corner sat what appeared to be a navigator station, though the symbols on its console matched those on the gate rings rather than standard galactic common. As night fell, Gabe made his way to the central building. The door slid open with surprising ease for a supposedly abandoned facility. Inside, Darkness reigned except for a faint, pulsing blue light emanating from the center of the room. As his eyes adjusted, Gabe saw an array of crystal tubes arranged in concentric circles. They reminded him of the musical hydroponics system he'd once been so proud of. Curious, he approached the crystal tubes. When he touched one, it emitted a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through his bones. Another tube produced a higher pitch when touched. Despite himself, Gabe felt a flicker of interest, the first genuine emotion besides despair he'd experienced in months. Probably some kind of atmospheric regulator, he mused, though he knew nothing about starport systems. On impulse, he touched several tubes in sequence, creating a simple melody. Something in the room seemed to shift in response, though nothing visibly changed. Fatigue finally overtook curiosity. Gabe returned to the control tower, which offered the best shelter, and unrolled his sleeping mat. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow would be the day. For now, he'd sleep. The morning brought a chill that penetrated the tower's walls, waking Gabe earlier than he'd intended. His temporary living quarters were even more depressing in daylight. Dust-covered consoles, abandoned mugs with centuries-old residue, and what appeared to be someone's desiccated lunch still sitting in a container. To his surprise, Gabe felt a twinge of housekeeping instinct. He'd always kept his farm meticulously organized, a habit from his military service before attempting agriculture. Before he quite realized what he was doing, he'd cleared a workstation and was wiping down surfaces. Ridiculous, he muttered to himself. Cleaning before dying. Real efficient, rusty. Still, the activity distracted him. He discovered that some of the tower's consoles still had power, inactive but not dead. Gabe remembered the portable power cell he'd brought for his personal devices. On a whim, he connected it to what appeared to be the main console's power input. The effect was immediate and startling. Lights flickered across the control panel. Displays sputtered to life, showing incomprehensible readouts in that same strange script he'd seen on the gate rings. A low hum began to build throughout the complex, and outside, the massive rings shuddered slightly. What the hell? Gabe scrambled to disconnect his power cell, but it was too late. The starport was awakening from dormancy, systems activating in sequence. Through the window, he saw the first ring beginning to rotate slowly, grinding against years of accumulated sand. Status lights along the perimeter of the landing pad blinked on one by one, creating a runway of illumination pointing toward the rings. Gabe's heart raced. Had he just activated some kind of beacon? Would others come? The thought both terrified and, strangely, excited him. Part of him wanted to shut everything down immediately to preserve his isolation. Another part, a part he thought had died with his farm, felt a spark of curiosity. Over the next day, Gabe found himself investigating the starport systems rather than contemplating his end. The more he explored, the more he realized this was no ordinary facility. The gate rings appeared to be more than simple docking structures. They contained mechanisms far more complex than necessary for spacecraft landing. In the crystal tube chamber, more tubes had begun to glow with that same eerie blue light. When Gabe entered, they seemed to pulse in response to his presence. He experimented with touching different sequences, and each time, subtle vibrations would run through the facility. During his second night, Gabe noticed something alarming. A tiny crack had appeared in the floor of the calibration chamber, emitting the same blue light as the tubes. Occasionally, what looked like energy waves would ripple outward from it, distorting the air momentarily. Probably just a coolant leak, he reasoned, though he knew deep down it was something more significant. For the first time in months, Gabe didn't think about ending his life once throughout the entire day. Instead, he found himself wondering what exactly he had purchased and awakened. On the morning of his third day at the starport, Gabe was attempting to decipher the control panel when a piercing alarm shattered the desert silence. Outside, a sleek vessel unlike any he'd seen before was descending toward the landing pad. Its hull bore no identification markings, just a strange symbol that matched those on the gate rings. Panic seized him. Was it pirates? Authorities? Had he inadvertently trespassed on some corporation's mothballed property? Gabe considered running, but quickly dismissed the idea. There was nowhere to go in the surrounding desert. Instead, he grabbed a heavy tool from his makeshift cleaning supplies and prepared to face whoever or whatever was arriving. The craft landed with barely a sound, its propulsion system far more advanced than the commercial shuttles Gabe was familiar with. A ramp extended from its side, and a figure emerged. To Gabe's surprise, it was a woman, or at least humanoid in appearance. She wore a form-fitting uniform of midnight blue with silver accents that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, emphasizing sharp features and eyes that gleamed with an unnatural violet hue. She strode purposefully toward the control tower, projecting such authority that Gabe found himself straightening his posture despite his situation. As she entered the tower, her gaze locked onto him immediately. "Who authorized you to activate this facility?" Her voice was crisp, accented in a way Gabe couldn't place. He clutched his improvised weapon tighter. "I own this place. Who the hell are you?" The woman's eyebrows rose fractionally. "You own a chronoport." She pronounced the word carefully, as if speaking to a child. "I don't know what a chronoport is, lady. I bought Starport Y. 87 fair and square. I have documentation." Gabe fumbled with his personal device, pulling up the transfer of ownership. The woman glanced at the document and let out a laugh that contained no humor whatsoever. "This is a Class 7 bureaucratic misallocation. Unauthorized sale of a temporal junction authority installation." She tapped a badge on her uniform that Gabe hadn't noticed before. "I am Senior Inspector Cressidia Quill of the TJA, and you are trespassing on a critical temporal infrastructure facility." Gabe's mind reeled. "Temporal? Like time?" "Yes, like time," Cressidia said with exaggerated patience. "This is not a starport. It's a chronoport, a temporal transit and regulation nexus point. One of 17 across this sector." She gestured toward the window. "Those are not docking rings. They're temporal aperture stabilizers." Gabe stared at her in disbelief. "You're telling me I accidentally bought a time machine?" "That is a gross oversimplification, but essentially correct." Cressidia pulled out a device and began scanning the room. Though how a civilian managed to purchase a TJA installation through standard real estate channels is concerning. "I'll need to file at least 7 different reports." Gabe slumped against the console. "Perfect. I came here to die in peace, and I can't even do that without paperwork." Cressidia's scanning device emitted a shrill beep. Her expression changed from annoyance to alarm. "What exactly have you been doing here?" "Nothing. I just hooked up my power cell to see if anything still worked, and then I found those crystal tube things in." "You interfaced with the harmonic calibration array?" Cressidia cut him off, her voice rising. "With what authorization code?" "I didn't use any code. I just touched them, and they made sounds, so I played around with." "You played around with a temporal resonance matrix?" She looked horrified. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Before Gabe could respond, the floor trembled beneath them. Through the windows, he could see the gate rings, temporal aperture stabilizers, apparently, beginning to spin faster, blue energy crackling between them. Cressidia's scanning device was now emitting a continuous alarm. "You've initiated an uncontained temporal fracture. The calibration sequence is incomplete, creating instability." She turned to Gabe, her earlier disdain replaced by urgent focus. "How long has the system been active?" "About 2 days, I guess." Cressidia's face paled. 2 days of unconstrained temporal energy accumulation. She manipulated her device rapidly. "The fracture is already at containment level 3. If it reaches level 5, it could destabilize the entire temporal field of this region." "Meaning?" Gabe asked, though he suspected he wouldn't like the answer. "Meaning everything within several hundred kilometers could be temporally displaced, fragmented, or erased entirely." Cressidia moved to the control panel, her fingers flying over the symbols with practiced precision. "I need to initiate emergency containment protocols." Nothing happened. The console remained inert under her touch. "It's not responding," she said, frustration evident in her voice. The system must have imprinted on your initial power source and biometric signature. Gabe felt a chill run down his spine. Are you saying it only works for me now? Temporarily, yes. The chronoport has accepted you as its operational authority until a proper reset can be performed. Chrysidia fixed him with an intense stare. Which means I need your cooperation to prevent a temporal catastrophe. Outside, the energy between the rings was intensifying, casting an eerie blue glow across the desert. The crack Gabe had noticed earlier had widened, now visibly releasing pulses of energy that distorted the air around it. I didn't sign up for this, Gabe protested weakly. Actually, you did. Chrysidia pointed to his ownership document. Section 17, paragraph 4. Purchaser assumes all responsibility for any dimensional anomalies arising from improper facility operation. It's standard TJA boilerplate that somehow made it into your fraudulent sales contract. That's insane. No one reads the fine print. Gabe exclaimed, and yet remains legally binding. Chrysidia's device emitted another urgent alert. We don't have time to argue jurisdiction. The fracture is expanding exponentially. I need you to help me stabilize the resonance matrix. Gabe felt trapped between his original dark purpose in coming to this place and the unexpected responsibility now thrust upon him. He'd wanted to die, yes, but not take an entire region with him, and certainly not by causing some kind of temporal disaster. What I need to do? He finally asked. Relief flickered across Chrysidia's face. First, we need to access the harmonic calibration array, those crystal tubes you were playing with. The temporal fracture can only be contained by establishing a stable resonance pattern. They hurried through the facility, which was now humming with energy. Panels that had been dark 2 days ago now glowed with the same blue light. The floor occasionally rippled beneath their feet, as if reality itself was becoming unstable. As they entered the chamber with the crystal tubes, Gabe gasped. The array was now fully illuminated, each tube pulsing with light. The crack in the floor had expanded into a small fissure from which tendrils of blue energy occasionally surged upward. That's not good, is it? Gabe asked. Level 4 containment breach, Chrysidia confirmed grimly. She removed a small device from her uniform and handed it to Gabe. This is a temporal harmonizer. It will help you find the correct resonance pattern. Gabe took the device, which resembled a small flute. I'm a farmer, not a musician. You're neither at the moment, Chrysidia said sharply. You're the only one who can interface with the system now that it's imprinted on you. She positioned herself at a smaller console near the crystal array. I'll monitor the fracture and guide you, but you need to establish the pattern. The harmonizer glowed with symbols similar to those on the control panels. When Gabe touched it, it emitted a tone that caused the nearest crystal tube to vibrate in response. I need to play a specific sequence, he asked, feeling overwhelmed. Yes, the harmonic stabilization requires a 7-tone sequence, repeated 3 times with precise timing. Chrysidia was manipulating controls on her console. I can provide the theoretical pattern, but only you can execute it through direct interface. Before they could begin, another alarm sounded, different from the temporal fracture warning. Proximity alert, Chrysidia muttered, checking her scanner. We have company. A new spacecraft was approaching, larger than Chrysidia's vessel, with predatory lines and obvious weapon systems. Temporal opportunists, she explained tersely. Scavengers who monitor for chronoport activations. They exploit unstable temporal nexuses for all sorts of illegal operations. Smuggling, timeline manipulation, paradox engineering. There are time criminals. Gabe asked incredulously. Where there's a regulated system, there are those who profit from subverting it. Chrysidia's expression hardened. They must have detected the activation when you connected your power cell. Now they're here to exploit the situation before TJA reinforcement arrive. The intruder ship landed just outside the perimeter. Chrysidia glanced at her scanner again and swore under her breath. We have maybe 20 minutes before they breach the facility. We need to stabilize the fracture before they get in. Gabe looked at the harmonizer in his hands, then at the expanding fissure in the floor. 20 years ago, He'd been a military engineer, trained to operate the outer defenses. Time was running out. Gabe closed his eyes, focusing entirely on the resonance pattern. He remembered how he used to calibrate his hydroponics, not by following technical readouts, but by feeling the rhythm of the system. He let instinct guide his fingers across the crystal tubes, no longer thinking about the sequence, but experiencing it. The tubes responded, their tones blending into a complex harmony that filled the chamber. The blue energy from the fissure began to synchronize with the pulses of light from the tubes, the chaotic tendrils gradually forming into a coherent pattern. "It's working," Chrysidia breathed, watching her scanner. "The fracture is stabilizing. Containment level dropping to 3, 2. The temporal opportunists burst into the chamber, weapons drawn. A motley crew of beings from various species, all wearing cobbled-together uniforms with matching insignia depicting a shattered clock face. Their leader, a scarred human with cybernetic implants visible at his temple, took in the scene with obvious disappointment. "Stabilizing the Nexus? That's a shame. We had buyers lined up for unconstrained temporal access." Chrysidia drew herself up to her full height. "In the name of the Temporal Junction Authority, you are all under arrest for attempted interference with a regulated temporal nexus." The leader laughed. "One TJ inspector and some random civilian? I like our odds." He gestured to his team. "Destabilize the array. We can still salvage this operation." As they moved toward the crystal tubes, Gabe continued the resonance sequence, knowing that interruption could cause catastrophic failure. Chrysidia positioned herself between the intruders and Gabe, drawing a compact but deadly-looking weapon from her uniform. "This facility is under emergency temporal containment protocols," she announced formally. "Interference is a Class 1 violation punishable by temporal displacement." The opportunists hesitated, clearly recognizing the severity of the threat. Class 1 violations were notorious. Offenders were sometimes displaced to particularly unpleasant points in space-time, like the formation of gas giants or the cooling periods of young stars. Their hesitation gave the time needed to complete the third repetition of the sequence. The crystal tubes reached peak resonance, emitting a sustained chord that made the air vibrate. The fissure in the floor began to close, blue energy retracting into it until only a thin line remained, pulsing with controlled energy. "Containment achieved," Chrysidia announced, scanner in one hand, weapon in the other. "Chronoport Y. 87 is now under official TJ emergency protocols. All unauthorized personnel must withdraw immediately." The opportunist leader assessed the situation, calculating his odds. With the temporal fracture contained, their leverage was gone. After a tense moment, he signaled retreat. "This isn't over, Inspector. Nexus points are becoming more valuable by the day. The Authority can't secure them all." As they backed out of the chamber, Chrysidia maintained her professional composure. Only when the sound of their departing ship faded did she lower her weapon and turn to Gabe. "That," she said with surprising warmth, "was exceptional work for a civilian with no training." Gabe set down the harmonizer, his hands trembling slightly from adrenaline and concentration. "I used to tune hydroponic systems to specific frequencies. This was similar. Kind of." Chrysidia's lips quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Interesting transferable skill." She consulted her scanner. "The containment is holding, but the chronoport will need a full recalibration and security upgrade. I've already sent an emergency report to TJ headquarters." "So what happens now?" Gabe asked, suddenly aware that his plan to die in isolation had been thoroughly derailed. Chrysidia looked at him appraisingly. "That's complicated. You've created quite the administrative paradox." Meaning you legally purchased a TJ installation, however that was possible, and then prevented a level 5 temporal disaster that you accidentally initiated. She tucked her scanner away. "There will be an investigation, of course. Someone at the Real Estate Classification Bureau has made a catastrophic error, listing a chronoport as abandoned property." Gabe sighed heavily. "So I'm in trouble." "Not necessarily." Chrysidia led him back toward the control tower. "The TJ values results. You demonstrated considerable aptitude with temporal harmonics. That's rare. In the control tower, Chrysidia accessed a secure communication channel through her own equipment rather than the facility systems. Her conversation with her superiors was brief, conducted in technical jargon that Gabe couldn't follow. When she finished, she turned to him with an official air. The situation has been assessed, and Gabe prompted when she didn't. Continue. The TJA faces a dilemma. This chronoport has imprinted on you and your power source. A full reset would require shutting down all systems completely, which would leave this sector without temporal oversight for at least 3 standard months. That sounds bad. It would create numerous vulnerabilities that temporal opportunists would certainly exploit. Chrysidia straightened her already impeccable uniform. Therefore, the authority has authorized a temporary solution. Gabe waited, wondering what bureaucratic nightmare awaited him. You will be granted provisional custodial status of Chronoport Y-87 under my direct supervision until a proper transition can be arranged. I'm sorry, what? Gabe blinked in confusion. You're being offered a job, Mr. Anderson. Chrysidia's tone was matter-of-fact. Facility custodian, temporal grade 3, with appropriate security clearance and compensation. Gabe's laugh was hollow. I came here to die, and you're offering me a job? Chrysidia's expression softened slightly. Perhaps the universe has other plans for you. The universe hasn't exactly been kind to me lately, Gabe muttered. And yet, here you are, the accidental owner of a chronoport, with a natural talent for temporal harmonics. Chrysidia gestured around them. This facility needs maintenance, monitoring, and protection until a full TJA team can be deployed. Your alternative is extensive questioning at TJA headquarters, followed by memory adjustment and relocation. Put like that, the choice seemed obvious. How long would this custodial status last? Minimum 3 months, possibly up to a standard year. Chrysidia produced a tablet displaying a contract. The position includes living quarters, supplies, training, and a stipend. All legal and containing only the standard 17,000 clauses. Gabe stared at the contract, then at the facility around him. He'd come here seeking an end, but instead found, what? A purpose? A reprieve? A cosmic joke at his expense? What about my debt? The bank will still be after me. TJA employment grants automatic financial deferment under the Critical Infrastructure Personnel Protection Act. Chrysidia pointed to a clause in the contract. Your creditors cannot pursue collection while you're engaged in temporal security functions. It was temporary, but it was something more than he'd had 3 days ago. Certainly. I'll need my power cell connected to the main systems, he said, making his decision. And I want to understand how those crystal tubes actually work. For the first time, Chrysidia's smile was genuine. We can arrange that. The TJA values curiosity, within regulated parameters, of course. As the sun set over the desert, casting long shadows through the massive temporal aperture stabilizers, Gabe found himself sitting on the roof of the control tower. Beside him, Chrysidia had shed some of her formal rigidity, her legs dangling over the edge as they shared his synthetic whiskey. To bureaucratic misallocations, she toasted, taking a small sip and grimacing at the taste. Gabe raised his flask in return, and temporal disasters narrowly averted. They sat in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. Tomorrow would bring TJA supply ships, training protocols, and the beginning of Gabe's crash course in temporal maintenance. For tonight, though, there was just the desert, the stars, and the realization that endings sometimes weren't. I still don't understand how a chronoport got listed as abandoned property, Gabe mused. Chrysidia sighed. Form TJ 7729B was probably filed instead of TJ 7729D. The first classifies a facility as temporarily inactive, while the second designates it undergoing scheduled maintenance. Add in some database migration errors between departments, and suddenly temporal infrastructure is being sold on the open market. That's disturbingly plausible. Welcome to the bureaucracy of time management. Chrysidia took another sip of whiskey, where paperwork can literally alter reality. Gabe laughed. A genuine laugh, his first and longer than he could remember. Below them, the chronoport hummed with contained energy, the crystal tubes emitting a soft, harmonious glow that painted the desert in shades of blue. You know, he said thoughtfully, I came here to die alone. Instead, I nearly broke time, got a job I don't understand, and now I'm drinking with a temporal cop on the roof of a time machine. Chronoport, Chrysidia corrected automatically, then smiled. And yes, the universe does have an odd sense of humor. In the distance, one of the temporal aperture stabilizers emitted a shower of blue sparks, a minor fluctuation that would need attention in the morning. For now, though, Gabe was content to watch the stars and contemplate the strange turns of fate that had brought him here. To new beginnings, he said quietly, raising his flask once more. Chrysidia clinked her container against his. In time management, Mr. Anderson, there's no such thing as endings. Only transitions. As night deepened over Chronoport Y. 87, the facility's lights cast a protective glow against the darkness. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, temporal maintenance, bureaucratic paperwork, and the inevitable complications of working for an interdimensional authority. But for tonight, Gabe Anderson, ex-farmer, failed entrepreneur, and newly minted temporal custodian, felt something he hadn't experienced in years: possibility. Life had more chapters to offer, it seemed, even in the most unlikely of places. And if temporal opportunists or bureaucratic errors threatened that newfound purpose, well, he had a knack for harmonic resonance and a surprisingly effective partner in Senior Inspector Chrysidia Quill. It wasn't the end he'd planned. It was perhaps something better, a new beginning humming with potential like the crystal tubes below.